Welcome to Newton's Laws of Music, MIDI Edition Lesson 2. In this lesson we're going to be covering velocities and other event messages within a MIDI event or within a MIDI clip. The first section of this lesson is going to go through some definitions. We're going to define a couple of terms so that we can all be speaking the same language and understanding what each other is saying, or more to the fact you can understand what I'm saying. So again, we're going to be looking at velocities and other event messages within MIDI. Alrighty, so the first MIDI event message I would like to speak about is velocity. We'll get a definition from physics first, and then we'll look at the musical side. Velocity is defined as the rate of change of position. It is a vector physical quantity. Both speed and direction are required to define it. That is what physics, and you can read the rest of it yourself, that is what physics considers velocity. And that's not too far off from what we will be figuring to be velocity in the MIDI standpoint itself. Velocity, again, defined as a rate of change of position. So the next thing we are going to look at is velocity defined within music or within MIDI. Velocity is a channel message that is sent with every note on and note off channel message, and it defines the speed in which an event is executed. It has been defined as a number from 1 to 127 for each event, no matter what the key, note, or pitch, and the higher the number, the louder the note will be. In most programs, the normal default for velocity is 64. Obviously that is pretty much right in between your 1 and 127, so it's a medium velocity. This next event message that I'd like to speak about is note on. It's an extremely easy concept. Basically, I'll use a keyboard as an example. When you press down the key on a piano or keyboard, while you are still holding that down, that is considered note on. So the MIDI event that is sent is you press the note down and it's note on. That will continue to hold until you release. That will then take us to the next definition, but that is called a note off. So again, a note on is when you initiate the sound, whether it be on a keyboard or really any other musical device or any instrument for that fact. Okay, so that takes us to note off, and basically it is a MIDI event that signals that the note has been terminated in any number of ways. Again, using a keyboard as an example, that would be the equivalent of me releasing the note. The velocity that deals with a note off event is it can also be defined by numbers from the 1 to 127. So it can have its own velocity, and basically it is the speed at which the note is released. Opposite, of course, as a note on, which is the speed in which a note is initiated. And lastly, I'd like to define note duration. Basically all a note duration is in a MIDI event is the time between the note on event and the note off event. So again, the duration is defined by the time between the note on and the note off events. This would be the sustain or any other thing that is going on, the fade, whatever it might be. Once that note off event has been applied, that is when the duration ends. So again, time between the note on event and the note off event is considered the duration. We will probably be looking a little bit at the modification of durations within MIDI events. So I wanted to make sure we had that information. Okay, so let's go ahead and start applying velocities to our MIDI notes on, of course, our digital sheet music as we spoke about in lesson 1. So I've gone ahead and prepared some tracks here. I have essentially, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 measures. So that's 8 measures in each measure except for the bottom for the bass guitar itself. I actually have everything separated into two 4 measure clips, and then we're going to go ahead and look at these. So again, most of these topics, how to actually paint the notes, the MIDI events and such, we went through in lesson 1, so I wanted to make sure that instead of boring everybody, that I had this all done ahead of time so that obviously you can see it's a little more complicated than the first lesson. So there are a couple of ways to apply or define velocities. Now we're going to go through a couple of them. The first one that I'm going to go through is I'm going to go ahead and go to the properties of this clip. And when in the properties of this clip, I'm going to go ahead and select the list editor. Now as you can see, there is a good deal of events already here. These were velocities that have already been marked. But I simply want to go through these to give you a better understanding of what the velocities are. So running down the piano, our piano roll, we see that we have 4 events with no velocity off and a default velocity on. Those 4 notes are on the C in the 3rd octave, the D sharp in the 4th octave, D sharp in the 3rd octave, D sharp in the 4th octave. So those define where those notes are, and in this case, those notes would be C, D sharp, D sharp, D sharp. So that would mean that this note right here, according to our chart that I'll bring back in, it has an on and off velocity of 127. So that is the max velocity. We can actually run through the rest of this, and you can see, of course, as we go through this, that what we're looking at here is every note, time format, what MIDI channel, the message, what the data is, so in this case, which note, then our on and off velocities, and our data duration. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Forgot to show you one thing, so I'm going to open that back up very quickly. So if I wanted to modify one of the velocities, I can double click in any one of those boxes and type in the number I want, and now my velocity is set. My off velocity is set to what I want for that one particular note. How you apply and when you apply velocities, that is going to be of your own doing and own choosing. That is the part of the creativity of music, to understand what should be a little louder than other things. So one of the other ways that you can modify or throw in some velocities is, at least in the program I'm using, which is the Sony Acid Pro again, of course, my draw tool. If I'm on my draw tool, I can actually double click on a MIDI event and it shows me what the velocity is, or the velocity has been set to. So double click on that one, you can see that it shows now 64. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all the events. Let me do that once again. Select all the events in this clip. I'm going to specify to set their velocities to default. Now you can see that same velocity that was 127 is now 64. Let me do that also on this clip. So I'll actually do a select all. Velocity set the default. I had specified earlier that the default is 64, so now all of our notes should be 64. So the first thing I want to do is I want to play this so you can hear how it sounds with all of the notes for the drums, which is what we're working on here. All of the notes on the drums are set to default velocity. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. So as you could hear, that was pretty bland, pretty basic. So in light of that, what I'm going to go ahead and do, now I've already mapped out where I want my midis and what they're going to look like. And with the drums at least, or in this case, I'm going to select set to maximum, which sets these midis now to 127, and then again 64. Then I'm going to go in, and again, as I said, I've predefined all of these so I do know what I want and where I want it. Now I'm going to set that to maximum. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and repeat the process. And again, so that just bounced off the screen there, but really all I'm doing is just setting to maximum like I've done everything else. I've got one other that I missed, so I'm going to hit that one very quickly. Set it to max, and now what you should see is that these are now set to what they should be set to. Let me make sure these set properly. And they did not, so I had some kind of issue with the velocity. So this type of work can be tedious, and normally it is tedious. But you just spend the time and you do it right, and you'll get the results you want. Alrighty, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and play this drum track as it sits with all of the velocities in place, and you'll be able to hear the differences, the feeling that has now been injected into the performance that wasn't there before. So again, you should have noticed a major difference in how that sounded. Everywhere where I put a velocity of 127, the note got stronger, sharper, and obviously stood out from the rest of the notes, so it was no longer bland or almost even monotone sounding. So that's on the drum clip itself. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mute the drums, and we're going to go down to the guitar I have here using the Real Strat VSTI for this. And the first thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and check our velocities. It would help if I'm on the right tool. So let me check. So I've got a velocity now. You'll notice something here. The velocities that I'm setting on these various events within the guitar clip are not maximum. I have noticed in dealing with these that when you try to set the velocity to the maximums, it really just doesn't sound right with the guitar. To be very careful about how you set your velocities on these types of notes, because the louder it sounds, it just sounds like somebody turned the volume up instead of just applying a certain amount of additional pressure or speed when you pluck or pick the string. So as you can see, I've been using 89. I'll probably jump that up a little bit, but what I'm going to do here, just like I did before, set all events. I'm going to go ahead and say velocities, set the default, do the same thing on this clip, select all, velocity, set all to default. So now what I should have is by itself the guitar with no velocity, so everything should be set to 64. Let's go ahead and play this and see what we get. So not bad. It could use some more energy, could use a little bit of feeling. So now I'm going to do with this exactly what I did with the last clip. I know exactly which events I want to select. So I'm going to maximize this out just a little bit more so it's a little easier for me to work with. to the next, I have actually gone ahead and set those up. They are kind of a mirror of one another, just a few steps up from the other. I actually copied the one clip, pasted it in, created another clip from it, so all I had to do was move things up and down slightly. So the next way I'm going to show you to enact a change in MIDI events is we're going to go into the MIDI processes and filters. Now the main thing I'm concerned about here is going to be velocity, so I'll select that. And I'm going to go ahead and say change start and release velocities. I want to use the same velocity. Now there's a number of ways I could do this. The change could be an invert. It could be a generic or definite set to. As you can see, that's 64 right now. I could add to the current velocity. I could scale by certain percentage of the current velocity. In this case, on these notes, it was 64. I can limit, so I can say that it's not allowed to jump up above, say, 90 or 95. That again is important. If you're doing your change over time, you can actually specify that as the song continues to roll, that velocity gets higher, and you can specify either percent or just the number itself from 127, and you can say it's either a curved climb or a linear climb. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this slider over, and I was using 89 before, but I'm going to bring this up to 100. So I'm changing the velocities of all the notes I've selected to 100. Not adding to it currently, I'm simply taking the current value, wiping it out, and setting it to 100. A couple of other things you can do with this is I can apply to selected notes only, which is what I have. I can apply to all the notes on a selected event. So this MIDI clip itself, I could change the velocities all at once, or apply to all notes on a selected track. So if I wanted to modify the velocity of all of the notes on this entire track in both of the clips, I could select that. At the moment, all I want to do is the notes that have been selected, so I'm going to hit apply. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here. Let's scroll this over. I'm going to do the same thing on this section. I'm going to say MIDI processing and filter, velocity, set this to 100 as well. And I'm going to change both my start and my release velocities and set them to selected notes only. I've hit apply. Now I'm going to X out of this. Now let's go ahead and play this and see if we can tell the difference. It's not going to be as obvious as the drums, but we should still notice a difference. So with that, you should have noticed just a slight upwards in volume, a little faster hit on the I would say that's the first note in the second measure. It did have a little more strength to it. I've done that across the board, so every one of those has that exact same velocity setup. Now you'll notice the only thing I changed was that one, which in this case is a 16th note. So all I've changed in the velocity, and each chord is a 16th note, and it does make a difference. It does add a little bit to it. So now let's go ahead and listen to the drums and the guitar with the MIDI already applied, with the velocities already applied, and let's hear what that sounds like now. So as you can tell, there's definitely a lot more feeling in that than there was before. The last thing I'm going to do here is I've already pre-prepared one other line, and I'm just going to throw this in here to show how a song can start to fill out when using velocities. On my bass line, this first note on each one of these areas, which is, I believe, the beginning of a measure, it actually does correspond directly with the ending of the guitar measures. Each one of these one little notes, these little 16th notes, have been set to a velocity of 100, and then their trailers are still 64. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and play this from the beginning. So it helps. Velocity obviously gives us a little more energy, a little more power. It kind of defines the flow of the song. Um, just like with anything else, you need to spend time, you need to practice, you need to work through it. This clip itself probably took me upwards to about 3 hours to create. So it's not a slow process. I mean, we're only looking at 8 measures here. We're looking at a sum total of about 20 seconds, but once you start getting a hang on it and start getting a feel for it, you'll get a good understanding of where the velocities belong. Sometimes you won't apply the velocities on the end on the note off. Sometimes you will. It really all just depends. It comes down to practice and practice. I will probably, through continuing lessons, refer back to the velocities and spend a little more time on certain areas of velocities in regards to whatever those areas we happen to be working on. So this definitely is not the last time we'll be talking about it. Velocities will be part of every lesson from here forward. This really is just a basic setup. This is a introduction, we'll say, to velocities. Um, so again, to wrap up, we've got our velocities, which is basically the rate at which a note is sounded. Um, we have our note on, which is the sounding of the note, a note off, which is the termination of the sounding of that note, and then the duration, which is the length of time between your note on and your note off. Thank you.